Hey everybody, I'm Vicki Gatchell, Director of Central Institute at Central Ministries, and I have two guests with me here today for our podcast. Immediately to my left is Dan Baker, Family Ministries Pastor at Central, and immediately to his left is Rob Bogle, our group's pastor. So, fellas, can you say hello and maybe just say a little bit about what you do at Central, and then we'll move on to some questions.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. I am the Family Ministries pastor, which means that I get to oversee everything birth through college, but I spend a lot of my time with the high school students. That's kind of my main role within the Family Ministries, is to run the high school ministries.
That sounds great.
And I am the group's pastor, which includes life groups, Central Institute, men's and women's ministry. My main focus is on the life groups and men's ministry, and then I have a great team with Troy and Vicki and Amy in the women's ministry, CI, and men's ministry.
Awesome. I'm glad to have you both here with me today.
Glad to be here.
Picked a topic that I thought would be of interest really to everyone, and it's the topic of calling in ministry. Now, most people, when they hear the thought about calling, they think of how a pastor is called into ministry. And both of you being pastors who have been formally called into vocational ministry, I wondered if you could share a word about that first, and then we'll get into the calling of all Christians.
Sure. Yeah. So I can remember I grew up going to a Lutheran church, and I was in catechism class. And so I'm probably around 7th grade. And I can remember sitting there. I don't know what the topic was we were talking about at the time, but I was looking at the pastor. We're sitting around a table, and the thought just dawned on me, like, he must have mentioned something about calling. I was like, how does he know that God was calling him to be a pastor? And that was the first time in my life I thought, what would that be like for God to call me to be a pastor? It was nowhere near what I thought God was calling me to. And it was still a number of years until I was actually called. But I can remember that thought, that feeling of like being called to ministry.
Mysterious.
Yeah, it seemed mysterious. It's like this big thing.
That? Yeah.
So that was probably 7th or 8th grade. Fast forward to probably my junior year of high school. I had gotten really involved in campus life ministries and had some personal spiritual turning points in my life, and really surrendered myself to where God was leading me. And what that looked like was a lot of leadership roles within campus life ministries. And I was personally really struggling with, what am I good at? You know, like by junior year of high school, you're looking for, what am I going to do in college? You're trying to figure out like what job you want to have. And I was really struggling in my identity to know, what am I good at? And I didn't feel like I had that thing like, oh, I'm really good at this. So that was a big question for me, of what am I good at? And as I started to get more leadership roles in ministry and leading my peers, what happened for me is I started to lead. And as I stepped into things that I didn't think I was that good at, I knew I wasn't good at, especially speaking in front of people, doing a lesson. And then in the midst of that happening, and afterwards evaluating it and realizing, hey, that actually went kind of well. Yeah, and so it was seeing the tension between, I know I'm not good at this, but somehow I ended up being good at it. And that was the realization that, wait a second, a lot of what ministry is being obedient to what Christ is asking you to do. And he's the one that's good at something. And that's what captured me. And I was like, that is what I want to do. I want to just make myself available to Christ to do what he's asking me to do. And that's what I would say is the secret to my success. That's what drew me into, now I want to go into ministry. That's what told me that I should go into vocational ministry when I was 17 years old.
Right. I wonder how many of us can remember back to that first time when we saw God use us in a way that we didn't expect for something that we thought, I can't do this. And God showed up and he did it and used it. Like, that can be a lot of direction right there, I think.
Yeah. So that was really powerful for me then.
Excellent. How about you, Rob?
Yeah, mine was very similar growing up in the church. My dad was a Christian school principal, but he also taught a Sunday school class. My mom worked in the church office. My grandmother worked in the church office. So I was around the church. Yeah.
You were there.
If the doors were open, we were there. If they were closed, we had a key to get in.
Yeah.
And so I was heavily involved, and even in high school, early years, was involved in the ministry by running the sound equipment. We had to set up a portable system each week. And so I was involved in that. Then got involved in the radio ministry that the church had and the recording of the services, and just started doing things with the youth pastor, with the other volunteers, and really began to have a passion for it. And Scripture says that if you desire the office of the pastor, you desire a good thing. And that desire began to well up within me. And through my dad, talking with him, talking with youth pastors, really had that affirmed that, yeah, you would be able to do this.
Yeah.
And I was fighting with God on it. And part of it was a fear of, well, where God will send me.
I feel like that's a common fear.
What if he sends me to Africa?
What if he sends me to Africa?
That's what everybody says.
What if he sends me to China? What if he sends me to the
if?
other side of the world and I never see my family again?
Yes.
And one year at youth camp, Psalm 139, verses 7 through 12, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I make my bed in heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there, your hand will lead me and your right hand shall guide me. That came up four times in 1 week, over
Somebody
and
was
over and
speaking to
over
you.
again. And so it was like, I'm arguing with God. And then Psalm 139 keeps coming up. A buddy of mine, they had an opportunity where you could preach a 5-minute sermon and they would critique. And so we were both going to do it, and we traded each other's notes, and it was Psalm 139. Then our devotional
Way to go, God.
our devotional one night was Psalm 139. And then the youth pastor was talking and brought up Psalm 139. And then the last sermon of the week came out of Psalm 139. And finally I'm like, okay, God, I realize I can't go away from you. So that was really how God solidified, because I'm not always the first to catch on, and wasn't willing to say, okay, God, you can do whatever you want with my life.
He's like, okay, Bogle, I'm going to tell you over and over and over again until you hear it, right?
And so, I mean, just that passage, and those have kind of become my life verses, that it doesn't matter where I go, doesn't matter how good things get, doesn't matter how bad things get, doesn't matter how fast things are going or how slow things are going. God is right there with me.
He's right there.
And I'm not going to get away from him. He's going to be right there by my side. And so that was huge. And then the other part was when I was in college, a lesson that I was given to help students or even adults with this was one of the professors said, there's a difference. A lot of times when we say, well, what's the will of God? Well, let's separate what the will of God is and the plan of God is. And let's talk about them slightly different so that we can keep track of which one we're talking about. The will of God is God's will for everyone. And the plan of God is his plan for me specifically. So for me, vocational ministry. For someone else, it's going to be different. He said, but if you want to know the plan of God for your life, you have to be obedient to the will of God, because the will of God is the same for everyone. So if you're not doing what you know is the will of God for all Christians, then don't expect him to give you the plan for your life when you're not obeying the thing that he tells everyone. When you start that, when you're being obedient to what God tells all Christians to do, then you'll start to see his plan for you as well. Whatever that might be, whether it's vocational ministry or whether it's day-to-day ministry in a secular vocation, but yet you are a full-time Christian, no matter where your paycheck comes from.
Yeah, that for sure. We'll circle back to this area in just a minute, but I did want to ask, because I was listening to you, how important, this could be for either of you, how important was the affirmation of people around you in realizing how God was calling you?
Obviously, it matters a lot. I don't know if at the time I realized the importance of the affirmation of others. In my family, when I was in high school, I was leading spiritually out of everybody else in my family. So I didn't necessarily have a lot of family members who were around me. My parents were very, very supportive, and that was helpful. They paved a way for me to follow the calling that God had for me, but they weren't necessarily the voice of affirmation for me. But I had a youth pastor, and then I would say it was more subliminal affirmation. And as I look back, not subliminal in some weird way, but subliminal in the fact that as I look back, I can see how God put people in my life that continued to confirm that this was the right path.
Yeah.
It didn't come to me as somebody saying, hey, I see you're wanting to go into ministry. I confirmed that in you. And it wasn't that direct.
Right.
But he continued to put people in my life and examples in my life that I was drawn to. And so as somebody who now sitting here has been in active youth ministry for 18 plus years, I had people in my life when I was in college, just starting this journey of vocational ministry, who had been in ministry for 20 plus years. And I noticed that then God caused me to pay attention to that. And that was something that he tuned my heart towards. I had a desire, like those are the people that are my example. Those are the people that I befriended, that I listened to, that were my mentors, that I modeled what it meant to be a youth pastor after. And so it was affirmation, but it didn't come in the form of somebody just came up to me and says, I affirm that you should go into ministry. I didn't have a lot of people doing that.
It sounds like that still small voice though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Within you, where you just know like, okay, God is just showing me this. I'm going to pay attention to what he's saying. So, okay, very good. Rob, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, mine was very much similar, where there was the still small voice inside, a youth pastor who would take me with him as he was doing youth ministry, and would pick me up, spend the day with me, would pour into me. The guys that worked in the radio room that would say, okay, here's how you do this. Now we're going to teach you how to do it on that youth board over in the other building. And mentors. Go do it. And if you have any problems, call us. And letting me do those things. And then having actually a different youth pastor that one day was like, hey, the leaders for your children's class, the children's church class, they're on vacation, so you get to teach. You'll be fine.
You'll be fine.
And just kind of, you can do it.
Was that your first teaching experience?
Yes.
Surprise, you're up.
And
you're up to bat.
It was, but he was like,
he knew you could do it.
You can do it. Then my first real teaching planned, the pastor of the church walked in and sat down right as I started. And I'm like, he would go to different Sunday school classes and he just happened to pick the youth. But I'm like, who told him I'm teaching and why is he here? But afterwards he came up to me and said, hey, you did a really good job. And so little things like that, where it wasn't affirmation as in, yes, you need to be a youth pastor. It was just encouragement as I went through, just accepting the opportunities that were put in front of me. And then that still small voice saying, this is what I want you to do. This is what I want you to do. And then people coming around and saying, here's how you do it. And you can do it.
I like that idea of a little bit at a time. I'd like to kind of flip the discussion now, because the two of you have made a life thus far in vocational ministry. But every Christian has a calling. God puts a calling on each of our lives. Let's start out with the calling to come to Jesus. John 3:16. I guess it may be the most famous verse in the world, but I mean, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever would believe in him would not perish, but would have everlasting life. That's a big call, right? The world. God put that out to everyone. And ask everyone to respond to that. And he's waiting for people to come to that. How would you compare this verse or that call to Jesus? Like, how would you describe that to someone if you were going to say, yeah, that's a call. That's a call he's putting on your life? Because I think maybe for the average Christian, we don't think of that as a call so much as just, oh yeah, that's a famous verse that I believed at one point.
Well, I think to connect a little bit to what Rob was saying earlier about God's will and God's plan, but also when we look at the word calling, I try to explain to students often when we really start to study words and look at certain words, our culture uses words very differently than the authors of Scripture. They were much more willing to be figurative in the way that they used language, whereas we tend to want to be much more literal. Concrete, and we want to keep a definition right here in a certain spot.
We want to know what,
So when we say the word calling, a lot of times the idea that we have behind that is there's this big important thing behind you have been called by God to do something. And I think in all reality, it has a little bit more to do with what Rob was saying about plan. God's calling on your life isn't necessarily always and only one thing.
Mm-hmm.
God calls you, hopefully, on a regular basis, sometimes down to the day or the minute. God is calling you to do something. Or another way to put it, God is inviting you into a plan.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you accept that invitation, and sometimes you don't accept that invitation.
Yeah.
I think God's big enough then to shift his plans around. You're like, all right, well, you didn't step into that one. All right, well, I'm going to work out my stuff here, but all right, I'll come back to you tomorrow. You're not ready to.
I'm going to give you another
mhm.
opportunity.
So when we say calling,
Yeah.
calling to Jesus, that is the first calling that God has
Yeah.
on our life. And
Yeah.
that may take some steps, but that's the first and biggest. As Rob was saying, if you're not going to be obedient to what God's will is in your life, then there's not much more of a plan that he's going to
He's not gonna
involve you in.
Yeah.
I
Not
like
going to reveal anything more.
yeah,
to you.
I like to explain to students, you have to be somebody that is prepared to do what God is wanting to do in this world. If you want to be a part of God's kingdom, you have to
Mhm.
prepare yourself to do that. So the first one is to come to Jesus.
Yeah.
You have to have, it's that first main point, like, who do you believe Jesus is? And do you
Mhm.
want him in your life? Do you recognize you need help? You need God in your life in order to go forward. So that's the first thing we're called to. Everything else can't come until
It
after
can't
you've
come until
accepted
that initial step.
Yeah, that first call is a call of repentance.
Mhm.
And it's a turning from the direction I was going, and now I'm going to Christ.
Mhm.
And that is the starting point for any other calling any deeper. Starts with that call of salvation, that call of repentance to make Christ the kind of the object of our life. I'm
Mhm.
pursuing relationship with him.
Yeah.
And so everything else is going to flow out of that. If I haven't turned from doing things my own way,
Yes.
then I'm going to miss God's plan. And a lot of times, one thing that you kind of alluded to was there's not necessarily just one thing that you can do.
Mhm.
I share, I knew that God was calling me into ministry, and I had 2 Bible colleges to choose from. I don't think that if I had chose the other one, I would have been out of
Oh, yeah.
God's will
Right.
by going to a different Bible college. Now, would my life look different? Probably. I would have probably never met my wife,
Mhm.
but I don't think I would have been out of God's will by going to a
Right.
different Bible college.
Right.
Or so we don't have to be paralyzed by, well, what if I make the wrong
Yeah.
decision? There are things that God gives us the freedom to choose
Yeah.
some of the aspects of
Yeah.
that calling as we pursue him.
And that's a good thing to know too, because I have seen people kind of freeze with, I'm not, they want to please God. They want God to be the center of their life. And then all of a sudden they're frozen by, I'm not sure if he wants this for me or if he wants this for me. And sometimes they are 2 equally good choices. And
Mhm.
I think you're right.
I like to explain it. I think God is bigger than that. We look at it as,
Right.
I've got this choice and this choice. And we think, if I choose the wrong one, somehow I'm now outside of God's will. And I think
Right.
we take a step back. God is smarter than we are. And I think God realizes that you have 2 choices in front of you.
Yeah.
And if he didn't want you to have those 2 choices, he would have shaped it differently.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think he wants you to walk through the steps of choosing one. And like Rob was saying, if you choose this way, then he's going to use you in his will in this direction. If you choose this one, then he's going to use you in his will in this direction. Either way, God is more than capable of using you no matter which way you choose. Now, he may have a different plan down this path or this path, but neither one is outside of his will.
Either way, he'll get you
Yeah.
where you're
Right.
going. Okay, let's move on to the call of all believers. I mean, once we have believed in Jesus, when Jesus left the earth, he gave a commission to his
Mhm.
followers. And I also believe that this is something we all need to believe in too. And it sets the very direction for our life. It's found in Matthew 28. We refer to it as Christians as the Great Commission.
Mhm.
Where Jesus says, go into all the world and preach the gospel and teach and baptize and disciple and make people that will be followers of me. That's something that each of us, if we belong to Jesus, we can be confident that God has called us to do that. Any comments on that?
Yeah, just the idea that we're called to go, whether it's to go across the street, whether
Mhm.
it's to go to work and
Mhm.
be a testimony at work, whether it's to go into our community, or whether it's to go to another country or across the oceans, we're told to go. And really, it's as you are going,
Yes.
make disciples.
Yes.
Go, and as you go, this is what you should be doing. You should be making disciples. And so whether it's going to work, going to school, going to the park, going to the grocery store, there are opportunities for us to share. And then we're also told that we gather together.
Mm-hmm.
We gather together, we learn,
Mm-hmm.
we take it, we apply it, we go and we share it with others.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gathering together and then scattering out into our community, and then gathering together and scattering out into our community, that is for all Christians,
Mm-hmm.
not just pastors or those in vocational ministry or just the really spiritual ones.
Right, right.
All Christians are told to go
Right.
and make disciples.
I think another thing to look at is in that passage in Matthew, Jesus wasn't, again, in our culture, we like to individualize things.
Sure.
And so
Yes.
Jesus made this great commission, and it was to all of us. We tend to interpret that as the whole commission was all for me, or the whole commission is now also all for you.
Gotcha.
He was speaking to a crowd. His intention was to speak to the whole church. The responsibility of the big vision that he gave
Mm-hmm.
was to all of us. And we all play a part in that. We all play a
Mhm.
role in that. I had, years ago, we were doing some street evangelism with students, and one student just took to it and he loved it and he was so excited. And this was a kid who in his public school would just jump up on his lunch table and preach the gospel.
Yeah.
And he had no fear about it. I had another student be like, I don't feel called to do that.
Yeah.
I don't think that's me. And I had to affirm that student and say, you're right. Not everybody is supposed to
Don't do
be
that.
a
Yes.
quote evangelist and be that person sharing the message in that way. Everybody's supposed to perform a different part of it. Everybody is called to a different part of the Great Commission. That doesn't mean that you only have one small subset.
Mhm.
It's just that we are all called differently. So today your calling may be to be a support in the Great Commission.
Mhm.
He may call you, who doesn't seem gifted in public speaking, to speak publicly
Sure.
at some point.
Sure.
But that doesn't have to be that now your role forever or your identity forever is to be the one speaking publicly.
And
He
that
may-
we're all cookie cutters too.
Yeah, he may be calling you today to be the one to speak publicly. And it's the one time you ever have to do it. Or maybe it's today, and then 10 years from now, you'll do it again.
Yeah.
It's God's will, not your will. You don't have to create an identity around a specific calling.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think too, around the idea of as you are going, to preach the gospel. I feel like in years past, we as Christians tended to divide up the things we do a little bit more. Okay, this is a Christian realm
Mhm.
and this is a secular realm. Whereas that really is not a biblical concept. Like God considers our entire life to be holy. He
Mhm.
wants us to work at whatever we do, whether it's a secular vocation or vocational ministry.
Right.
All of it is to be done with all our
Mhm.
heart to the glory of God. And so really, whether a person is in ministry as a vocation or whether they go out and they deliver mail or whether they work at a grocery store or they're a mechanic or they're a doctor, God has called us to take part in his big commission
Mhm.
as we go. Any comments on that at all?
I just remember an illustration of a story of a guy who he was a Christian and he cleaned porta potties.
Okay.
And he would always just go to the nth degree in detail and cleaning them so that they were spotless and they were, everyone that he cleaned was almost like it was brand new. And when asked, he said, why do you do that? He said, because I do all things to glorify God.
Yeah.
And even as I clean a porta potty, I want God to have the best that I can do. And so I clean each porta potty to the best of my ability to the glory of God, so that when people walk in, they know that I take my job seriously and I do it as if God is my boss, because when it really comes down to it, he is. I'm living my life for him.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one illustration that's just kind of always stuck with me. I don't know if it's a true story or just one of those stories.
Actually, I know
that's used,
somebody
but-
who does that, and he does
Yeah.
a fantastic job.
Yeah.
That's what he does. Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter what the job is.
Right.
Are we doing it to the glory of God and to the best of our ability?
And I think that's the foundation to calling. Are you, in some ways, rather than saying we've been called by God, it's called to these different callings. We've been called to a willingness from God. I think one of the things I think is important to talk about when we talk about calling also is, I've been a youth pastor. That's been my vocation for 18 plus years.
Right.
But you don't find that job description in Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Right.
you can say, I have been called to youth ministry. And that's easy to say because now we can look back and say, wow, well, you've been doing it for 18 years. So you must have been called to youth ministry. That's not the case. This is grateful and blessed that this is the job that I've been able to have. And I have been called to doing what I've been doing. But I learned that this difference I'm trying to describe here. I learned this a long time ago. I had a fellow youth pastor that I was working with, and she took a different job in the church to do a different role. And one of the other youth pastors who, and I share some of the pride that he has in being a youth pastor, but he spoke out of his pride of being a youth pastor. He was a youth guy. I mean, to look at the guy, you're like, he's totally a youth pastor.
Skinny jeans.
Well, that's good, but he was, always wearing shorts, goofy guy, loved to just be active. He was, anyways, that was his identity, was to be a youth pastor. And that's fine that he took that identity. She was a great youth pastor, but her gifts and her passions and her skills were different. And so out of his pride, he says, so you've been doing this for 3 years with us being a youth pastor. Were you not really called to youth ministry? And he was asking honestly, not trying to be hurtful. Sure. And she said, God called me to be a youth pastor for these 3 years, but what she was gifted and skilled at, God was continuing to move her on to use those gifts and skills in a different way. And she was amazing at building teams, at developing leaders, at care. And that was a role that she got moved into more. And what she said is, I feel like I've been called to use these gifts, not to sit in this seat, not to have a certain role.
Right.
He felt called to be.
Go ahead.
He felt called to be a youth pastor. She felt called to use these skills. And so sometimes we're called to a role. Sometimes we're called to a group of people. Right. So sometimes you may be called, some missionaries are called to a group of people.
Right.
And you don't care what the job description is. You want to reach those people. So it may mean opening a school. It may be opening an orphanage. It may mean creating a ministry that drills wells or whatever. But you do it because you love these people and you're willing to do whatever God is calling you to do for these people. Some people are called to a certain job. It's, I know how to do construction and I want to do that to the best of my ability. So you go and you find ways of making that a ministry. Yeah. We're called in different ways. We're gifted and skilled in different ways. And sometimes we're called to roles. Sometimes we're called to certain activities. Sometimes we're called to a group of people.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a great synopsis. We're pretty much running out of time. I want to wrap it up. It's a great discussion. I love to have these types of discussions. I always learn from people and their perspective and their life experience. One thing that has been really impressed on me by God recently is just the idea of, this thing we call our walk with God is really a walk with God. And a number of years ago, I really felt like he was calling me out of my quote unquote secular profession, where I had already been sharing Jesus there for 20 years, but it just seemed like God was asking me to change my focus. And at that time, I was thinking new destination. But since that time, God has taught me, no, it's not about a new destination. It's about continuing the walk that you're already on. And that has been really key for me. And I think that how it applies to all of you who are out there is just that it doesn't matter if you're in what we would have termed a secular vocation. If you're at home taking care of babies or your elderly parent or, no matter where you are, that as you walk with God, he will ask you to do different things and to be continually just spending the time with him to listen. And I feel like he'll impress it upon you. There's a few different ways. One is through his word. If you're spending time in his word, you're going to know the overall will of God for your life. Others may affirm you in the things that they see you're capable of doing and the things that they feel that you do well. And then also God opens doors and closes doors. And to be spending time with God is to be looking for where he opens a door and to walk through it when he opens it. So thank you for your time. Appreciate that. Appreciate you being here today. And we'll see all of you next week.